So good afternoon, all of you. My name is David Levi-Faurt, and we are in a webinar series on theories of regulation and governance, regulatory governance. Today we have the opportunity to congratulate and to celebrate together with Yuval Feldman, Professor Yuval Feldman from Bar-Ilan, his new book, which came out recently in Cambridge University Press. And the book is called Can the Public Be Trusted? Yuval will present the book and the main ideas from it. But first I will present Yuval. So many of you know him already. I will just say that he's the Mori Lazarof Professor of Legal Research at Bar-Ilan University at the Faculty of Law. He's also, by courtesy, a professor in the psychology department of Bar-Ilan University. Is the head of the ERC-funded grant on Voluntary Compliance Lab. He deals in his research in behavioral analysis of the law, experimental law and economics, behavioral ethics, computational law, regulation, enforcement, and compliance. Feldman has co-authored more than 80 papers. His first book, The Law of Good People, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. So thank you very much, Yuval, for presenting your book with us. And I ask you, can the public be trusted? So please go on.
Thank you, David. Let me now try to share the right. Yeah, I think this is the one.
Yes,
okay.
It comes up. Yes, excellent, excellent. Go
on. Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you, David, for the invitation. An honor to be in such a respected webinar series. And I would like to present the main ideas of my book. And again, part of also co-authored with David in the past and doing it in the present. And I think some of the thing we try to do is kind of bridge the gap between regulation and compliance. And I think that this book is actually a very good attempt to do it in a sense of trying to connect between what the state is doing or assuming about people and how will their behavior be in those situations. So in a sense, trying to answer a very, I would say even ancient question of to what extent the way the state treats people will affect how they behave, or it's coming from kind of completely different sources. So it's mostly a behavioral research, but it's very much trying to interact with an institutional perspective, and will really appreciate the insight of people from this kind of audience probably know more than me about the kind of political science aspects of this interaction between state and people. It's some of the research is related to a research group that I have with the ERC that focus on voluntary compliance. And this is kind of the main paradigm that we focus on in the book. So we have part of what's sometimes called a regulatory toolbox. We have things starting with sanctions, duties, so things which are both more kind of interacting with intrinsic motivation or more coercive, moving towards things which are more intrinsic and cooperative. And this is really like a partial list. You could, especially if you take all the behavioral intervention into account, it's really a lot of potential intervention by the court. And the question that I try to ask is to what extent those interventions are related to things like quality of compliance and dual compliance, things that I'll talk about in the next slide, and also to things like population type, so different people reacting differently to those regulatory interventions, to culture, to doctrines, and also do some comparison of tax compliance and environmental compliance, and also try in the book to kind of connect a lot of literatures which, interestingly enough, rarely speak to each other, although they should. So something like behavioral public policy, which is really a growing community, you don't have almost anyone there who is interested in regulation. And again, I tend to attend many of the conference of both kind of the regulatory governance and behavioral public policy. It's almost never the same people, which I find to be super interesting. Also literature related to compliance, which is kind of a third community, things related to social norm cooperation, which is a fourth community. So it's really a lot of different communities. Many of them try to ask similar questions. So what's the best way to get from people not just compliance, but them wanting to comply, which is kind of the basic questions I deal in the book and also in my research group, and also trying to reverse kind of the trust paradigm. And I know, for example, David and others talked a lot about regulation and trust, but here it's not so much the trust in government institution, but it's kind of trying to reverse it. To what extent some of the way we engage or intervene with people behavior is actually related to the behavioral assumption we have about people. So this is kind of this idea of the effective voluntary compliance, which is kind of the holy grail of what I'm trying to achieve, and really try to understand, can we actually find any evidence that certain interventions are more likely to lead to more prolonged, more resilience, with higher willingness to pay, with higher quality of compliance, with things related to beyond compliance, so people doing more than they asked to do, with kind of positive externalities, in a sense that if I'm treated fairly or I'm treated in a certain way, I'm also going to be better in other domains unrelated to the specific. To what extent the type of regulation will lead to higher internalization, which is also something we care about, and also about the broad distributional impact. And again, a lot of the research, and I kind of talk about it in the book, are kind of comparing averages. But I'm trying to do that actually in many ways we care a lot, not just on changing the averages, so what percentage of people pay taxes on time, but also on the distributive effect. So when we look at the distribution of compliance, what kind of regulatory intervention will have what effect? Trying to also kind of cover both the descriptive theories related to how hard it is to find causality, especially if the DV, the dependent variable, is not attitudes, but actual behavior, how to deal with heterogeneity in a population, which raises a lot of problem, again, both behaviorally, but even more so from being a legal scholar. I'll talk a lot about kind of the need for equality, which make the ability to be innovative in your regulatory approaches really, really hard. Things that I'm trying to show that there are a lot of mixed findings. Even if we find a significant effect, the effect sizes are relatively small. The effects are usually, measured a couple of minutes after the intervention. So what does it really tell us about the behavioral change? The cross-domain predictability is also something we spent, we dedicated a couple of project papers to, is to what extent, for example, if someone is good in their compliance, let's say in tax domain, we can assume is also going to be good when it comes to the environment. So to what extent your compliance profile is domain specific, or if you are the kind of person who always comply willingly, you will do it across the board. And then obviously related to questions to what extent we can take your past behavior and use it to decide how to treat you. Again, from a legal perspective, and especially now with the whole debate about algorithms naturally knowing more about people and are able to do better personalization, to take into account past behavior in better ways, to what extent we allowed to do the cross-domain sometimes, and something we started to examine. There is this feeling of how it's called, what's happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? So if I'm a really bad driver, this should stay on the road. You can't, or you're not even allowed to treat me differently if you're the tax collector, knowing that I'm a really horrible driver, which I find to be interesting. And also the malleability of culture. And again, culture is a huge, I have a whole chapter on kind of culture, trust, and voluntary compliance, and to what extent we should treat culture as a moderator that is knowing, for example, if it's a high or low trust, we can decide whether to use certain types of regulations versus others, or we can actually even take a step further and think, okay, since we are using maybe more trusting approach, maybe this in itself will lead to a cultural change, which is obviously a higher bar, and some scholars suggest it might happen. Another important, this is kind of the vaccine versus mask wearing, which again, in truth, it's a lot of my interest in this project, starting from doing some work in COVID era with policymakers, is to think about the difference between vaccination and mask wearing. And I know some people will not like this example, but to some extent, when it comes to vaccination, we don't really care about things like beyond compliance or quality of compliance or prolonged resilience, in a sense that once we convince people you should get the vaccine, they come to the clinic, they give you their shoulder, you give them the vaccine, that's it. I mean, compliance ended at that. It's not more effective if you smile. It's the same. However, mask wearing is kind of the counter example where, again, I'm not a doctor or anything, but it was kind of research suggested, for example, that if you don't cover your nose, the efficacy of the mask was really limited. So that's an area where we need people to do a high quality of compliance. It needs to be with high willingness to pay, because let's say you walk and you have, it's unpleasant, or depending on the weather, needs to be resilient, prolonged. I mean, all those things are things which we treat different when it comes to mask wearing. And again, there are a lot of examples, legal examples in between, but we need to take that into account when we think about what is it that we do. Another whole chapter I spend on kind of arguing that, and it's kind of almost silly, that even the word voluntary is completely vague, in the sense that do you mean non-coerced, or you mean more, how do you treat, for example, incentives? It needs to be intrinsically motivated. What happens if you do something not coerced but without awareness? So there's a lot of competing definitions. And again, I'm trying to argue that part of the fact that this whole area is not treated consistently is related to the fact that there are so many competing concept and kind of different ways to think, okay, what is it that we need to do to keep this voluntary? And this is kind of this table. So just I added this slide because I felt in the past people were not completely sure, because I tend to say, okay, on one hand, on the other hand. And so this is kind of main takeaway. I'll kind of go back to that towards the end, but just to maybe lower expectation, because I can't really tell you whether the public should be trusted as a yes or no question. Overall, I mean, the project started optimistic, but ended up being very pessimistic. And some people, even reading the book, told me you can see it through the chapters. So the first chapter are more optimistic than the later chapter, which tend to see that we don't have enough evidence for the things that we're hoping to achieve. And this is kind of, I think for now, we don't have enough concrete evidence to suggest that necessarily more cooperative regulatory approaches are likely to ensure voluntary compliance, especially not for everyone. We understand more about the consequences of voluntary compliance rather than on how to get there. And this is kind of this whole idea about the evidence base, which I think is quite limited for now, with some of the limitations I mentioned in the previous slide. This does not suggest that we should not try. I think there is a lot of value of states trying to get voluntary compliance, but I think it's important to understand they're probably never going to get there. So I think it's important to try and improve, but to get to some situation where we can ensure voluntary compliance and to some extent kind of not engage in some other regulatory, more kind of coercive approaches is probably unrealistic. I'm dealing in the book with limitation of some of the critiques. So, for example, crowding out, which is the main critique of why can't you do both? Both try to focus on intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation at the same time. I'm trying to argue that crowding out is a bit overrated. And again, the behavioral impact of it is not that high. And also trying to think about algorithmic enforcement as potentially a way to do more kind of monitoring with less behavioral consequences, although again, I think we are now, it's still in the middle of the debate. And the last thing is kind of this idea that if you want to trust everyone, you will end up trusting no one. So at the end, we need to be able to develop, and this is, when I say we, it's for legal scholars mostly, to come up with some way which will allow states to trust only some of the people, again, only based on past behavior. And I know it's complicated because, I even discussed that sometimes past behavior in itself might be related to group characteristic, which is definitely something we wouldn't want to be taken into account when we try to define who should we trust and, pledges and stuff like that. Also, again, this might, I don't want to spend, how am I with time, David?
I think you're fine in terms of time. You can go on.
Okay,
please continue.
So just I mean, I think people do it in a book when they, discuss their own work. I hope it's okay. So I'm actually doing it in a book, try to say, okay, what do I think from my own research about whether indeed trusting people, voluntary versus mandatory, does it make sense? And the truth is, it's actually, I have in my own work, results contradict each other. So this whole question of mandating, is that a good thing or a bad thing, is really, really complex. And this is just I don't know, like 10, 11 examples from studies, some suggesting that we can improve. Actually, the third, I think also I misspelled Rinat's name, but also with David, about the voluntary reporting, but also research with Tom Tyler about whether mandating procedural justice is good. We show some surprising effects about voluntary ESG disclosures. We actually show how limited it is. In some context, in nation law, for example, we see a reverse effect. So in many of the studies, we actually see that it's even that. So even if you want to answer the question, is mandating a good or a bad practice? If we see something which we are interested in people doing more, what will happen? Very, very hard to predict, which also suggests, how complicated people are and why, in a sense, at the end of the day, the answer will never be kind of a main effect. It will always be in interactions. It will always be depending on, a whole series of moderating factors. So what's good in voluntary compliance? I think generally speaking, I think this has been shown a lot. This idea of people doing more than they asked, getting a higher quality of outcomes, more sustainable practices, and generating positive externalities. And again, the line of work of Tom Tyler, Margaret Levy, many others show that people are more cooperative if you explain to them, if you treat them with respect, if they don't feel they're being pushed, they don't feel that you measure everything they do, where they try to be very kind of limited in what they do. Those things reducing enforcement costs. So there's a lot of positive factors associated, and this is the reason why we should try to get a voluntary compliance, in terms of positive externalities to culture. So we probably better off living in a world where people feel that their government trusts them and treat them with respect. So all of those things, in a sense, very hard to argue against the usage. This is kind of a major thing that I talk a lot about, is kind of the difference between encouraged, which again is like Tom Tyler work, which suggests that if you give people more voice, they will more likely to engage in cooperative behavior. But Tyler work is about encouragement. It's not so much about ensuring, right? So in a lot of situations, and I'll talk a lot, not a lot, I'll talk in the presentation towards the end, that in some legal contexts, we actually very much interested, not just in getting a couple of more percentages of compliance, we need a lot of the people, or sometimes even the really vast majority to comply. And then the question is, what do we do with those softer approaches? Or maybe then we have to resort to more coercive or extrinsic measures. There is the question is, what exactly are we changing? Again, the vast majority of studies is actually about attitudes and preferences, not about behaviors. And this is again in research about virtue and stuff. So is it something which is likely to increase voluntary compliance if, for example, we try to focus on the more kind of general values behind compliance? Think like, be honest, be trustworthy. Those things are, how much is their relevancy to voluntary compliance? And again, there are many open questions. Some of them we focus on in the research group I mentioned. So, for example, there's a study we do now showing that if you nudge people, maybe you're not gonna see them as really regulators who actually have a firm conviction that what they expect you to do is wrong. So sometimes, for example, the softer approaches in itself signal to the population that this is not really an important, because if it was important, we would have taken much harsher measures. So it's kind of sometimes not even willing to pay the political price of, raising taxes or doing the more kind of harsher, less trust-based regulation. We have a huge problem of predictability, and Milkman is always showing it in her studies, that she assembled, like a lot of the time, a panel of experts, asked them to predict what intervention is likely to be the strongest, and sometimes she gets like zero, even negative correlation. That is, even people working in these areas of behavioral interventions, when they need to predict efficacy, get it wrong, which again, one should ask, okay, so what should we do? Should we always collect data? Which some people say you always need to collect data, but it's easier to say than to actually do. And again, this idea about over time, which I think is super important for voluntary compliance. So if we want to do less monitoring, for how long can we do it? I mean, we kind of give people a free pass. Yeah, we trust you. So it's not just, sometimes it's the teacher coming out of the room and allow the kids to take the exam without monitoring, or something which is a very limited thing. Or to what extent can we actually kind of really expect that to work over time? Or what I think will happen is actually some collapse of the equilibrium in that regard. To what extent we need people to be aware. This is related to the whole debate about voluntariness, whether if people, for example, are being nudged to do something, is that seen as voluntary because no coercion was involved, or we actually want people to want to comply. And again, some of the best practices from a behavioral perspective, things like habit, which tend to be stronger than a lot of the other things, is actually, in a sense, try to reduce your awareness to what is it that you do. We mentioned also the distributive, to what extent this is likely, so the voluntary approach versus things which are more coerced or mandatory, how is it affect not just the averages, but the proportion? So we might expect to see some higher quality of compliance by, let's call them the good people, but worse by the bad people, or again, this is the enhancing versus ensuring. I already mentioned, and also mentioned the I think oversimplification of the whole crowding out argument, because it's not necessarily the case that it might work better with things like moral motivation to comply than with things like scientific motivation to comply. Both are intrinsically motivated, but are reacting differently to extrinsic interventions. Some of the perils of voluntary compliance, and in a sense, this is kind of what makes the book somewhat, and I got already this critique. So, are you saying that or the other? Because you kind of seems to advocate passionately in both directions. But I think, again, the problem of heterogeneity is a huge problem. And again, some of you from Israel might know this example, but there is in Yom Kippur, which is the most holy day in the Jewish calendar, there is a social norm, no law, that people don't drive. And always seen as kind of an example for a voluntary compliance, in a sense that you see when there is no laws trying to force people into behaviors they don't believe, you just kind of ask people to respect, then it's actually working much better than when you make it into a law, which actually happened with some other religious laws in Israel. And it became kind of a situation where all the kids takes their bike to the streets, and because there are no cars, and it seems such a strong norm that kids feel very safe on the roads. And then every year now, there are a couple of fatal accidents for the some drivers who do actually end up driving and ending up running the kids running their bike. So this is just kind of an example for, in a sense, it's a good example for voluntary compliance, but also demonstrates its limitation, because probably, if it was a law, there was a lot of resentment and people would be upset, but maybe such accidents wouldn't happen. And again, I'm not advocating for each direction, just trying to show the complexity. Another kind of major issue is the idea of conditional voluntary compliance. So again, behavioral game theory, for example, suggests that most people, not most, but at least more than 50% or even more, tend to comply only to the extent that they believe others will comply. And again, voluntary compliance is very problematic because we tend to have really pessimistic views about others. Most people believe themselves to be more virtuous than others. There are a couple of biases which might explain that. And this in itself might suggest that in the long run, we are not going to see a stable equilibrium of cooperation without monitoring, which, and again, might lead to an erosion of trust. And the last point, which I think is, we see it in certain domains, if we expect governments to elicit voluntary compliance, we might put them on the road to brainwashing and manipulation, because if the government only rely on sanctions, we tend not to like such governments. But to some extent, there is a lot of honesty going on, in a sense that you as a taxpayer, let's say, don't believe in the tax system, will try to evade. However, the government say, we will go after you and we'll take everything you have if you don't pay taxes. Then you end up paying taxes. You may be very upset, but the government at no point doesn't need to try and say, well, paying taxes is great, or we should connect this with your citizenship, or with how you feel about yourself, or if you are really a good person, you should, I mean, there are a lot of practices going on when you try to expect governments to get intrinsic compliance motivation, you might put them in a road of really a problematic road. And also questions about democracy. I mean, is it something that we want? And again, coming from the behavioral world where we know a lot about how we can change what people believe. So this is something to be definitely concerned about, and maybe the whole idea of changing preferences, changing attitudes is problematic. And also there is this research suggesting it's not necessarily the case that even if you cause people to intrinsically believe, let's say, that paying taxes is important, you're actually going to pay taxes. And I will show even a meta-analysis that we have on that. So, this is here. It's actually a mega-analysis about a lot of participants. Again, we have some problems. So, this is with a grain of salt, but we find a negative effect of tax morale to tax behavior. So not tax attitude, tax behavior. So, and again, in the literature, which most of it covered tax attitude, it was seen as a positive thing, but at least from the papers, we were able to get the data from the authors, which sadly, a lot of authors didn't want to give us their data. But so we got 70,000 participants aggregated. We find the negative effect. There is some problem with this finding. Yes, so I think I will.
I think we are ready for discussion.
Try to get to the end.
Maybe you can summarize later, and we can discuss.
Oh, you mean to stop now? Sure. Okay, sure. So I should stop the sharing, right?
Yeah, and I will come back to the screen, and I will say thank you for the presentation. Good luck with the book. And I will start with a question that ask, takes you from your first book, The Law of Good People, to this book, or maybe even going farther to your dissertation. What's drive your research? What is the common thread between this book, the previous one, and the next one? How do you see your research profile, interest progressing? Where did they come from? Can you share with us your kind of intellectual journey?
Sure. So actually, I studied psychology and law as an undergrad, originally thinking that I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. And then because at least in Israel, you don't always get to the second degree, which is the one you get to be a clinician. So I thought I should have the backup plan, which will be law. So if I don't get to be a psychologist, I can then be a lawyer and still have a way to support my family and everything. And then during the studies, I really liked the connection between law and psychology and started to read a lot about it. And towards after doing the clerkship, I started to think, okay, so I want to be an academic, and this combination is really nice. Actually, during the studies in psychology, I recognized I'm not going to be a good therapist. So I thought, this is not for me. This is, I guess, for a different discussion. And then I looked at what law and psychology is all about, and was kind of amazed to see that all of the research at that point was on really marginalized group in society. So law and psychology was about insanity, was about kids, was about criminals, violence, people are dangerous or not, was an eyewitness, so these are about, regular people, but not so much about, regular people in the ordinary life. It was if you, were witness to a murder, how much can we actually trust your memory, or what things might affect your perception. And then I thought, but what about 90% of the people in 95% of their daily lives, where can't be the case that psychology is meaningless for their behavior. And then I started to look, and so one thing was that there was no one in Israel who could be the advisor. So I started to look abroad for a potential place. And also my wife wanted to do a PhD, so we tried to find the same university for us. She is still, but wanted to do a computer science PhD. And then I read more about Tom Tyler and then about Kahneman and Tversky, where they were more kind of doing the psychology of regular people. And interestingly, again, this is the late 98, 99, actually started in 99. So there was already the internet, but it wasn't like today. It took me even a time to understand Tom Tyler left Berkeley. He was at NYU when I arrived, and I kind of missed that from the time of the application to the time I got there. But still, there was really nice, great people over there. And then I actually recognized the connection to economics. So at the time, behavioral economists were doing, in a sense, more interesting stuff than psychologists, because again, for various reasons, psychologists, I think, mostly work within one theory most of their life and just try to use that theory to explain everything, while some extent behavioral economists or people, behavioral scientists, but not psychologists, were actually much more eclectic in drawing theories from psychologists to problems, which in a sense, again, coming from law, was more interested in trying to understand how we can understand legal dilemmas by actually emphasizing the behavioral perspective. So, for example, you mentioned my dissertation. It was, again, I read a book about, so Berkeley is kind of in the northern part of the Silicon Valley, which, again, this was already early 2000. It was booming. And I read a book saying that Silicon Valley is so great because employees tend to jump from one place to another with a lot of know-how in their minds. And I kind of thought to myself that it's interesting because it seems that the whole Silicon Valley was based on something which was illegal. There is something which is called trade secrets. And a lot of the things which were described in the news about people working in one firm, then either jumping to the direct competitor, and non-compete were not legal in California at the time. And so there was this whole kind of phenomena where people were jumping from one company to another, but they were seen as heroes and entrepreneurs and innovators. And I started to get interested in that. And a lot of my field work for the dissertation was on engineers in Silicon Valley, trying to understand their ability to self-deceive themselves and what is it that they do. So this became something that I worked a lot, is kind of this idea of good people. So ordinary people who see themselves as law-abiding individuals, ending up actually doing all kinds of things, but within the context that they were doing it, it became something which was normalized, and not just normalized, even seen as a really a huge achievement.
Yeah. So you moved from this was legal practice, right? Moving between jobs, and I hope that this will continue to be a legal practice, but it has problems, normative, ethical problems. So would it be true to say that you were working on the ethical person, and nowadays you are more and more working on kind of the the compliance as ethics, or is compliance or voluntary compliance or good people, the law for good people, is not connected to what you did in your Silicon Valley PhD? What is the difference? Where is the
So I think,
continuity? Where is
yeah, I
where is
think I see the continuity in a sense that when I'm trying to answer the question, can the public be trusted? To some extent, I'm trying to answer a behavioral question. I mean, obviously, it's an institutional question, and regulatory, and a normative question, but also it's a behavioral question. And the behavioral question is how many people out of a given population we can actually expect them to comply without any, sanctions, things like that, and how many are not. Is there a good way to know ex ante, so in advance, what's the size of the, what proportion of the population will actually cooperate with less sanctions or not? I mean, to what extent we can actually know that? What will happen in the long run if we do it? So, for example, the law of good people, which was the previous project, was about, again, people believing themselves to be great people, and the whole area of behavioral ethics, which I was trying to introduce to the law, suggested that actually those are the people which are the hardest to regulate. So people who believe themselves to be great and ethical and moral end up being the people who are not even things like, let's raise sanctions. It's not likely to work on someone thinking, well, they don't talk about me. I'm not doing anything bad. I'm actually a really, really great person. So they don't even see, even when they announce something about the enforcement authorities are about to do something, some people will not even recognize that to be their own behavior. To some extent,
yes.
Sorry.
Let me ask you another question. Do you have a perception of the individual, like a rational actor, and the paradigm of rationality, bounded rationality, or homo economicus, or the social person, or the political animals? Which type of paradigms are you part of, or you just reject the paradigmatic analysis?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think the attacks of rationality in the original, when they started, were focusing on two aspects. One was on people, cognitive ability to calculate risk, to understand risk, to make, consistent choices. So more kind of a judgment and decision making and optimization of people decisions. The focus I had in most of my research was actually on the somewhat neglected aspect of rationality, which is self-interest. So it's not whether people are smart, but is to what extent what motivates people is indeed their self-interest. Because if self-interest is the main motivation of people, then things like incentives and sanctions are enough. You don't need more than that to actually change their behavior. And all the attempts to try to convince them that this is the right thing to do, or legitimacy, or many other things, maybe they're not really needed, because again, people are rational. But if you tend to believe that what you actually want from people, again, depending on the regulatory context, maybe in some context, some could say in certain, I don't know, in tax, maybe, just kind of you calculate the risk, it makes sense for you to pay taxes, just do it, you push the button, then you pay taxes. But in many other contexts, like, things like environment or health, or even kind of, behavior within the workplace, we want more from people. We want people to, feel that they want to comply. We want them to really be much more involved. And in those situations, rationality doesn't give us the answers. So just because it pays to comply, we might see people, well, doing it because they don't want to get into trouble, but we don't want this compliance. And this is kind of this neglected role of motivation, which is missing in a lot of the research about rationality, because it's not just about accuracy and how good you are in making good decisions about the future, which is kind of the Tversky and Kahneman, typical paradigm. It's more about what do you get from people when you just focus on extrinsic motivation. To some extent, this is rationality. People are sensitive to price. The classical microeconomics perspective, or kind of a much more broader perspective where people have a lot of other things like identity and values and commitment and so on. Those things will actually end up being sometimes even more crucial, especially if you're interested in higher quality compliance. So not like a checklist approach, but people actually doing the right thing.
I see. And do you work at all in the framework of institutional analysis? What do you take from there, if at all?
So, yeah. So I think what I take from there is the understanding that in a very similar way that I disliked the fact that there was a discussion about people. People do that, which I always felt to be simplistic and lacking and doesn't recognize nuances and differences between people, and the expectation that people will always, and to some extent I spent most of my career on a more nuanced way to treat people. The other side of the equation, so you could say it's not, you have also markets, but let's say the government or the state is also seen by a lot of legal scholars as a very simplistic term. The state should do it. But the state is many, many things. And, I don't need to tell you that, the state could be so many different things. And so even when you say, well, people are problematic, let's do some intervention. If we want to answer the question in a really good way, we can't just focus on one. We have to understand people better, but we have to understand state in a much more nuanced way. The behavioral perspective will, talk a lot about perception of the state, not just, it could be that the state is great, but from a behavioral perspective, if people think the state is bad, it's not enough just to change the state. You need to also change perception. But we have to, if you want to answer the question in a much better way, we have to take into account in a more nuanced way what exactly is the state, and the different branches of the state and intermediaries, and what motivates the state, and can we actually trust the state to do the right thing? I mean, there are obviously their own political economy will tell us a lot of things about why the state in itself might not necessarily always be good.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me ask if there are comments. Let's collect a few comments and questions. And I see Michael Serra want to start. Please, Michael, and then others are welcome to add, and then Yuval will answer and conclude. Please, Michael.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. You mentioned as a side note the theme of algorithmic and AI governance. And I was wondering, considering the rise of algorithmic regulation and AI-based monitoring, do you see these tools as enhancing trust or undermining it? And could AI system may be designed to encourage voluntary compliance rather than simply detecting non-compliance? I was wondering, what are your thoughts?
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, this is
just a minute. Let's collect a few because we have limited time. Anyone else? Yes, Dor, please.
I was also interested to hear a bit more about the cultural. In one of your one of the components you didn't really dive into, I think it's the French versus Israeli example. I was interested if you could even expand a bit more on what you found culturally.
Okay.
Sure.
So I see two. So I will let you answer, and then we will conclude. Please.
So about Michael's questions about the algorithmic involvement or AI or Gen AI involvement in enforcement. So I think in many ways, I think the advancement of Gen AI is likely to ensure a more nuanced enforcement. So I think you don't, I think, algorithms have been around in compliance for many years. It's not just, it's not just the last 2-3 years. And then it was mostly really rigid measurements. I think you can see now that the Gen AI allows for more nuanced and smart way of determining when compliance happening or not happening, and levels of compliance. So I think in that regard, it might be seen that the development of algorithms might ensure greater, more human-like enforcement, and not just kind of this rigidity. Oh, you drove more than 60 miles per hour, then you are, or something which are very kind of threshold, very low discretion. I mean, those things I think were associated with algorithms. But I think increasingly with Gen AI, it can take a more qualitative approach to compliance. Also, I think it's interesting, and again, this is related to privacy. So naturally, if you have a police officer watching over your shoulder of what is it that you do, the crowding out probably is going to be stronger than if there is some, bot or raid, something going on and kind of will raise a red flag if you do something problematic. So, and again, I don't think those things were already studied, but I think, they might be seen to some extent as maybe less intrusive, although in many other ways there are more, because they're always there, and so I think I don't know yet of a good study that captured that. And about drawer question, so it's interesting that most of the studies we ran so far, we didn't have a very strong cross cultural findings. We might have some answers soon. We do find, for example, that high trust in terms of the European social values, stuff like that, were predicting behaviors in an expected way. But in some other studies, for example, for example, we had one study on polarization where it was far more complicated, the cultural effect, than we anticipated. It's a hard one. Again, I don't come from a cross-cultural. I was certain that I need to study that. This stage of the research, I'm not fully certain. I mean, I don't have a really new systematic finding about culture. In current research, many people will talk about the difference between, I don't know, Southern Europe to Northern Europe, stuff like that. It's definitely out there. Interestingly, maybe I will end with that. It's not necessarily the case that you need trust only for soft regulation. Also, for things like deterrence, we're definitely affected by level of trust in a given country. But I think at least I don't have still good results in how to answer that.
And just to understand, you're saying cross-cultural even only from like a weird countries, right? From European, you're saying even Western, which I assume is relatively somewhat homogeneous or similar. So it's interesting that you're saying even without including, I don't know,
No,
the global
but let's
South
say
and things.
Denmark and Greece are both in Europe, but are different.
Are different, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Very different.
Yep. So thank you very, very much, Yuval. It's time to close the discussion. It was very interesting, very ambitious, and very rewarding research agenda. I wish you good luck with the book and in general, and thank you all for taking part in this webinar. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.